Today we're talking to Neville Starick about his experiences with grief and what we can learn about normalizing grief and how we grieve. Welcome, Neville. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Samantha. It's really good to be here.
I'm really looking forward to our discussion as we dive in and look at grief from these various aspects.
Yeah, there's such a lot of fascinating things that we could cover, and I'm sure that we won't be able to do it justice today, but we'll have a good stab at it.
I reckon we will. So just so you know what our agenda is today, we're going to be talking about that grief is normal and that loss is tangible and intangible. We're looking at it from both sides. That grief has its own timetable and it works to its own schedule. That we all grieve in many different ways and all of them are valid. And that grief is more than sadness. And that one's where we're really going to dive into that and look at grief from all different aspects, because so often we just really link grief to the concept of sadness rather than all the different ways it shows up. Before we get into that, Neville, you're going to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey with grief and what you do for work as well.
Yeah, well, let's start with the easy question. I work in a counselling space. I'm a qualified counsellor with a master's degree in counselling, and I've been in the field now for about 12 years, 13 years now. And so grief is one of those things that is a part of everyone's life, but because it's such a common thing, we often have a backdrop of thinking that we know everything there is to know about it. And my interest in grief started as I was doing my counselling degree. And what happened was, part of my degree, I was actually doing another course as part of one of the requirements for one of my subjects. And in that, we started touching on the concept of grief. And I realized that I had a whole bunch of grief that had been sitting there that I hadn't processed through, that I hadn't even recognized was grief. Kind of known it was there, but just didn't think anything about it, didn't really pay any attention to it, didn't give it any time. And so that alerted me to the fact that grief was a part of my story that I probably needed to work through a little bit more. Didn't have a lot of idea of what to do with it at that particular point in time, but certainly it raised my awareness. And then when I finished my degree, I was actually working in a role as a generalist counsellor and had the opportunity to go and do a seasons program training, which is a course that's specifically focused on helping children and adults work through their grief, and using the analogy of seasons to kind of describe the grief process. And that really highlighted a whole bunch of things for me. One of the activities that we did in that training was that we actually had to do a timeline of all that we had experienced, what were the significant experiences of our life, and then identify where grief was involved. And that was just an amazing experience to actually do that, because it was just this realization for me that actually grief goes throughout all phases of life and it's connected with all sorts of things. I think a lot of people think that grief is only about a death and losing somebody that you love. And I had this massive realization, and the seasons training actually did that as well, that to highlight that grief is really about an adaptation to change. And where change happens, you're usually going to lose something in the process, and that losing something is what you're grieving, what it is that you've lost. So I kind of looked back at what had been going on in my life. I mean, my background was that I was born in the US. My parents were my dad's from Australia, my mother was from the US, and they had met in Papua New Guinea. And then started their family there, moved back to the US. I was born in the US, me and my brother were born in the US, and then they went back to New Guinea, and then we moved to Australia when I was 9. So one of my memories now, as I look back around the grief process, was not the recognition that I was grieving, but there was just this, my first experience of grief that I recall was when we were in New Guinea. We had lived on a mission station for the first 5 years that we were there, and in the same house. And I don't remember exactly when this happened, but I was probably around 8 when our family moved to another house on a different station that wasn't all that far away from where we had been living. We were still able to be connected to the community. We still went to the same school. There wasn't significant change, but it was just a different house and it was a different environment. And I don't remember the conversation leading up to the move. I remember that we were preparing for it. For some reason, the actual move date happened at night, and I don't quite know why. I don't remember those details, but I do remember that the truck was packed, all of our belongings were in it, and I suddenly got hit with this realization of that this is not going to be our house anymore. And so I remember sitting on the front step of our house and just crying about it. I mean, here I was 8, and it was like, suddenly I'm leaving this house. It's the only house that I remember. And we're going to another house. And while that's kind of exciting, it's like suddenly it was just this awareness of like, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And just this whole sense of loss of like, this is the place that I know. And now it's not going to be our house anymore. And yeah, so that was kind of a big deal, and that was a bit of a catalyst because I mean we moved to the new house and settled in with that, but then we didn't stay very long there, and that sort of we ended up leaving New Guinea and coming to Australia, and there was a whole bunch of upheaval that came with that for the next 4 years. So there was yeah, a grieving that just didn't have time to be resolved in that same way that that first experience of moving house had that opportunity to connect with that. So yeah, so just my own reflections on the grief process has just been that grief is just a part of life, but so often we discount it. So often we just move on to the next thing, and we don't give ourselves any space or time to look at how we've been affected by the change that has happened and what has the impact been. So yeah, that's just kind of a little bit of a story of where I've sort of worked through some of my own grief. And yeah,
because we've previously spoken about how you've moved quite a lot during your life, as have I, although I didn't actually leave my childhood home until I was 17. But when we came time to sell that childhood home 5-10 years ago, it was very easy for me to pack it up and say goodbye. But the loss of losing that house and what it meant only hit me a couple of years later. I didn't really understand. I thought I was going through this release process and this ritual for releasing it and moving on from this house. But I didn't actually even connect with the feelings I was having with at the time. They came years later.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting for me because I mean, when my family left New Guinea, there was so much going on at that time because we packed up our house, we sold stuff, we had the last week staying with friends, then we drove down to the coast and had some time with some other friends before we flew out to Australia. And then it was like we stayed with my grandparents, and there was there was always something that was going on that we just didn't really stop for quite some time. And so it was not until like I was 9 when we left New Guinea and arrived in Australia, and it was not until I was in my 30s that I actually reconnected with some of the grief around that loss, and that was really interesting for me because I thought I'd actually worked that through reasonably well, but I sort of ended up doing an overseas trip and went to Africa and spent a month in Africa. And the first 2 weeks I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I spent those 2 weeks just sort of feeling like I've been here before, and I knew that I hadn't, but it was like there were all these reminders of my childhood that I wasn't expecting at all. I expected things to be different. I didn't expect things to be familiar. And there were all these familiar things that showed up, and it just stirred up a whole bunch of stuff to such a point that when I left the Congo to go to South Africa to visit a friend of mine, I was on the plane looking out the window going, it's like, I'm feeling really, really sad. I'm feeling like there's this whole thing of I'm leaving a place that I love, but it's like, I've only been here 2 weeks. What's going on here? And when I finally got back to Australia after that trip, people were all excited about like, oh, how was your trip? Tell us about your trip. Tell us about your trip. I couldn't talk about it. I couldn't talk about it for weeks. I couldn't look at the photos. It was just kind of like, it was really strange. And yeah, there was a whole bunch of things that emerged out of that as I explored that. And yeah, it was just this I suddenly, for some reason, this was the time to grieve the leaving of New Guinea. And I'd never had that opportunity. It was really, really odd, really awkward in some ways, because it's like I didn't see it coming.
And that seems to happen a lot with grief, is if at the time that the loss occurs that we're not really able to process it, whether it's because we're not, for whatever reason, that it will just come back around later on.
Yeah. And that's been my experience, is that sometimes you don't have the opportunity. Sometimes you do as much as you can in the time, but there's more that you don't actually realize is a part of the whole grieving aspect. There are things that, I mean, I left New Guinea when I was a child, and I had a child's understanding of what was going on. But as an adult, I could actually see more, and I've had more conversations with my parents and so on about what actually happened around that moving. So I have, and also I had conversations with family friends who had told me things that I had never heard about that whole situation. So suddenly I had this awareness that there was a lot more things going on around that move than I had expected, which precipitated the move being the way it was, which I had never understood. It's just like, I'm not sure if I'd never asked the question, or we'd never been allowed to ask the question. I really don't know what the situation was, but it was just like there were a whole bunch of unanswered questions that were sitting there that I didn't even realize that I was holding and that were affecting me. And so as more awareness developed, as I moved into adulthood and had the conversations about what was going on at the time that we moved, suddenly there was more to grieve.
So as we gain understanding that just simply comes with life experience, we can realize there's actually a lot more grief left behind simply because we just didn't have the understanding earlier on.
Yep. And just to throw in, maturation actually increases our capacity to not just understand the grief, but to make sense of it, I guess. Which kind of, sorry, that sounds like replication there, but yeah, just to recognize the depths of it.
So in your work as a counselor and a coach, do you discover people have a lot more grief than they realize or appreciate?
Yeah, what I've actually experienced as I work with clients is that, and maybe this is because I'm a bit more attuned to this now after doing the training in my own work, is that a lot of people are coming in with emotional experiences or things that are out of character for them, and they don't understand why it's there. And one of the things that I learned to do was to start asking people, like, what's changed? What's changed in your life recently, or what are the changes that you've experienced over your life? And that actually was very insightful for a lot of people, because they'd sit there and they'd say, oh, well, I just did this, as if like that was just a small thing. But then I could then sit there and say, you just actually had quite a change in your life. And where there's change, there's usually loss. What have you lost in going through that change? And that would open up this whole other exploration there that is like, oh my goodness. It's like, I mean, I have this memory of a client that had come in, and her issue was, I'm just angry. I'm just angry all the time. And it was like, okay. And so initially it was like, well, what's the anger about? And there was a whole bunch of issues that were circumstantial about what was happening in the present, but the intensity of the anger was what surprised you. So this seems out of place for the situation that I'm dealing with. And then I asked the questions like, well, what has changed? And there'd been this whole history, this buildup of change on change on change on change that affected the relationship that she wanted to have with her child. And that was all building up, and there had been an accumulation over time for her. And when I suggested to her, do you think you might be grieving the relationship that you wanted to have with your child but haven't been able to? And she kind of looked at me and kind of thought, oh, maybe that's it. And she said, because I think her confusion was that I'm not really an angry person, but this anger is just here, and I don't understand it, and I don't know where it's coming from. But when we framed it in terms of being part of grief, she said, oh, well, that makes sense. Now I know what I'm dealing with. And that was what she needed. I didn't see her after that. It was just like, that was just precisely gave her the understanding of what she was dealing with and why it was there. And of course, as we're going to talk later about anger fitting into the grief process and being a symbol, being a signal that you might be in a grief process. So, but yeah, that was one of the things that I was aware of, is that the anger doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's also got a context. So, what is it about, and where is it coming from? And grief is often under there. It's not always, but often under anger. It's just one of the things that we're trying to make some changes that make things better, but because this grief is causing us so much pain.
And I think parents go through actually quite a lot of losses through every transition with their children, from newborn to toddler, from toddler to child to high school to the moving out. Like, there's grief and loss with every one of those stages.
Yep. And the whole letting go, it's like you started off with being very dependent, having this child that is so incredibly dependent upon you, and to actually learn to let them grow and develop their own independence can be a really hard thing for some people, particularly if they've had difficult family backgrounds themselves. Sometimes the whole child is a way of healing their own wounds from their own family of origin, and for the child to grow up and then leave can feel like abandonment, and there can be a real sense of grief around that.
So as an adult, as a parent, when your child reaches an age in which you experienced a loss, that could be a triggering for all of that grief to come back up.
It could. I had another client that I worked with who had gone through some rather significant trauma and abuse in childhood. And she had a daughter that she saw herself in. And so when the daughter got to a particular age, she got really anxious and really concerned about like what was going to happen to the daughter. But actually it was about her recollections of what had happened to her at that age. And she was able to see the distinction between that, but it would have been very easy for her to become very like clingy to the daughter, or preempt a whole bunch of things that the daughter probably wasn't going to experience, because her situation was very different from what the mother had experienced.
Yeah.
So